All right, so going to be going through book here, Endurance. So Endurance is a story written by Alfred Lansing, and it details the ill-fated Antarctic expedition by Ernest Shackleton in 1915, and it's kind of an interesting story, an interesting read. So starting with the preface, the story that follows is true. Every effort has been made to portray the events exactly as they occurred, and to record as accurately as possible the reactions of the men who lived them. For this purpose, a wealth of material has been generously made available to me, most notably the painstakingly detailed diaries of virtually every expedition member who kept one. It is amazing how thorough these diaries are, considering the conditions under which they were kept. In fact, diaries contain much more information than could be included in this book. These logs are a wonderfully strange assortment of documents, smudged with the smoke of blubber oil, wrinkled from being waterlogged, and then dried out. Some were written in bookkeepers' ledgers in appropriately large handwriting. Others were kept in very small notebooks in tiny script. In all cases, however, the exact language, spelling, punctuation have been preserved just as they were originally written. In addition to making these diaries available to me, almost all the surviving members of the expedition submitted to long hours, even days of interviewing with a courtesy and cooperativeness for which my grateful appreciation is hardly adequate repayment. Same patient willingness marked the numerous letters in which these men replied to the many questions which arose. Thus, most of the survivors of this astounding adventure worked with me graciously, with a remarkable degree of objectivity, to recreate in the pages that follow as true a picture of the events as we could collectively produce. I am extremely proud of my association with them. However, these men bear no responsibility for what follows. If any inaccuracies or misinterpretations have crept into this story, they are my own, and should in no way be attributed to the men who took part in this expedition. Names of those who helped make this book possible appear at the back of the book. AL, which is Alfred Lansing. So again, Endurance, written by Alfred Lansing. So this book was originally written in 1959, and then it was republished, this version published in 2014. So a couple pictures at the front, which I will kind of show you. So you can see a picture here, kind of a map of where they were just off of, so you can kind of see the peninsula there from Antarctica and how they were stuck in the ice and they ended up drifting. Further on the drift of the Endurance. And then here's a list of members of the expedition. So Shackleton at the top. All right, so part 1, chapter 1. The order to abandon ship was given at 5 p.m. For most of the men, however, no order was needed, because by then everybody knew that the ship was done. It was time to give up trying to save her. No show of fear or even apprehension. They had fought unceasingly for 3 days and they had lost. They accepted their defeat almost apathetically. They were simply too tired to care. Frank Wild, second in command, made his way forward along the buckling deck to the crew's quarters. There, 2 seamen, Walter Howe and William Bakewell, were lying in lower bunks. Both were very nearly exhausted from almost 3 days at the pumps, yet they were unable to sleep because of the sounds the ship was making. She was being crushed, not all at once, but slowly, little at a time. Pressure of 10 million tons of ice was driving against her sides. Dying as she was, she cried in agony. Her frames and planking, her immense timbers, many of them almost a foot thick, screamed as the killing pressure mounted. When her timbers could no longer stand the strain, they broke with a report like artillery fire. Most of the forecastle beams had already gone up earlier in the day. The deck was heaved upward, working slowly up and down as the pressure came and went. Wild put his head inside the crew's quarters. He spoke quietly. "She's going, boys. I think it's time to get off." Howe and Bakewell rose from their bunks, picked up 2 pillowcases in which they had stowed some personal gear, and followed Wild back up on deck. Wild next went down to the ship's tiny engine room. Kerr, the second engineer, was standing at the foot of the ladder waiting. With him was Rickinson, the chief engineer. They had been below for almost 72 hours, maintaining steam in the boilers to operate the engine room pumps. During that time, though, they couldn't actually see the ice in motion. They were altogether aware of what was doing to the ship. Periodically, her sides, though they were 2 feet thick in most places, bowed inward 6 inches under the pressure. Simultaneously, the steel floor plates buckled together, screeching where their edges meet, then buckled up, suddenly overriding one another with a sharp metallic report. Wilde did not pause long. "Let down your fires," he said. "She's going." Kerr looked relieved. Wilde turned aft to the propeller shaftway. There McNeish, the old ship's carpenter, and McLeod, seaman, were busy with torn pieces of blankets, caulking the cofferdam built by McNeish the day before. It had been thrown up in an attempt to stem the flow of water coming into the ship where the rudder and the stern post had been torn out by the ice. But the water now was almost up to the floor plates. It was gaining faster than the cofferdam could hold it back, faster than the pumps could carry it away. Whenever the pressure ceased for a moment, there was a sound of water running forward, filling up the hold. Wilde signaled to the 2 men to give up, and he climbed the ladder to the main deck. Clark, Hussey, James, and Wordy had been at the pumps, but they had quit on their own, realizing the futility of what they were doing. Now they sat on cases of stores or on the deck itself, leaned against the bulwarks. Their faces showed the unspeakable toil of the past 3 days at the pumps. Farther forward, the dog team drivers had attached a large piece of canvas to the port rail and made it into a sort of a chute down the ice alongside the ship. Took the 49 huskies from their kennels, slid down each one to other men waiting below. Ordinarily, any activity of this sort would have driven the dogs mad with excitement. Somehow they seemed to sense something extraordinary was going on. Now one fight broke out among them. Not a single dog attempted to break away. It was perhaps the attitude of the men. They worked with a deliberate urgency, hardly speaking to one another. There was no display of alarm, however. In fact, apart from the movement of the ice, sounds of the ship, scene was one of relative calm. Temperature was 8.5 degrees below zero, and a light southerly wind was blowing. Overhead, twilight sky was clear. But somewhere farther to the south, the gale was blowing toward them. Though it probably wouldn't reach their position for at least 2 days, its approach was suggested by the movement of the ice, which stretched as far as the eye could see, and for hundreds of miles beyond that. So immense was the pack, so tight that though the gale had not yet reached them, the distant pressure of its wind was already crushing the floes together. The whole surface of the ice was a chaos of movement. It looked like an enormous jigsaw puzzle, pieces stretching away to infinity, being shoved and crunched together by some invisible but irresistible force. The impression of its titanic power was heightened by the unhurried deliberateness of the motion. Whenever 2 thick floes came together, their edges butted and ground against one another for a time. Then, when neither of them showed signs of yielding, they rose, slowly and often quivering, driven by the implacable power behind them. Sometimes they would stop abruptly, as the unseen force affecting the ice appeared to mysteriously lose interest. More frequently, though, 2 floes, often 10 feet thick or more, would continue to rise, tenting up, until one of them broke and toppled over, creating a pressure ridge. There were sounds of the pack and the movement, the basic noises, grunting and whining of the floes, along with an occasional thud as a heavy block collapsed. And in addition, the pack under compression seemed to have almost limitless repertoire of other sounds, many of which seemed strangely unrelated to the noise of ice undergoing pressure. Sometimes there was a sound like a gigantic train with squeaky axles being shunted roughly about with a deal of bumping and clattering. Same time, a huge ship's whistle blew, mingling with a crowing of roosters, distant roar of distant surf, soft throbbing of an engine far away, the moaning cries of an old woman. In rare periods of calm, the movement of the pack subsided for a moment, a muffled rolling of drums drifted across the air. In this universe of ice, nowhere was movement greater or the pressure more intense than in the floes that were attacking the ship. Nor could her position have been worse. One floe was jammed solidly against her starboard bow. Another held her on the same side aft. A third floe drove squarely on her port beam opposite. Thus the ice was working to break her in half directly amidships. Several occasions she bowed to the starboard along her entire length. Forward, where the worst of the onslaught was concentrated, the ice was inundating her. It piled higher and higher against her bows as she repelled each new wave, until gradually it mounted to her bulwarks and crashed across the deck, overwhelming her with a crushing load that pushed her head down even deeper. Thus held, she was even more at the mercy of the floes driving against her flanks. The ship reacted to each wave of pressure in a different way. Sometimes she simply quivered as a human being might wince if seized by a single stabbing pain. Other times she retched in a series of convulsive jerks, accompanied by anguished outcries. On these occasions, her three masts whipped violently back and forth as the rigging tightened like harpstrings. The most agonizing for the men were the time when she seemed a huge creature suffocating and gasping for breath, her sides heaving against the strangling pressure. More than any other single impression in those final hours, all the men were struck, almost to the point of horror, by the way the ship behaved like a giant beast in its death agonies. By 7 p.m., all essential gear had been transferred to the ice, and a camp of sorts had been established on a solid floe, a short distance to the starboard. Lifeboats had been loaded the night before. As they went over the side onto the ice, most of the men felt immense relief at being away from the doomed ship, and few, if any, would have returned voluntarily. However, few unfortunate souls were ordered back to retrieve various items. One was Alexander Macklin, a stocky young physician who also happened to be a driver of a dog team. He had just tethered his dogs at the camp and was told to go with Wild to get some lumber out of the ship's forehold. Two men started out and had just reached the ship when a great shout went up from the campsite. The floe on which the tents were pitched was itself breaking up. Wild and Macklin rushed back. Teams were harnessed, and the tents, stores, sledges, and all the gear were hurriedly moved to another floe 100 yards farther from the ship. By the time the transfer was completed, the ship seemed on the point of going under, so the two men hurried to get aboard. They picked their way along the blocks of ice littering the forecastle and lifted a hatch down into the forepeak. The ladder had been wrenched from its supports and had fallen to one side. To get down, they had to lower themselves hand over hand into the darkness. The noise inside was indescribable. The half-empty compartment, like a giant sounding box, amplified every sound, every snapping bolt and splintering timber. From where they stood, the sides of the ship were only a few feet away, and they could hear the ice outside battering to break through. They waited for a moment until their eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, and what they saw then was terrifying. The uprights were caving in, and the cross members overhead were on the verge of going. It looked as if some giant vice were being applied to the ship and slowly tightening until she could no longer hold out against its pressure. The lumber they were after was stored in the black, dark recesses of the side pockets in the very bow of the ship. To reach it, they had to crawl through a thwartship's bulkhead, and they could see that the bulkhead itself bulged outward, as if it might burst at any moment, causing the whole forecastle to collapse around them. Macklin hesitated for just a moment, and Wild, sensing the other's fear, shouted to him above the noise of the ship to stay where he was. And Wild plunged through the opening and a few minutes later began passing out boards to Macklin. The two men worked with feverish speed, but even so the job seemed interminable. Macklin was sure they would never get the last board out in time, but finally Wild's head reappeared through the opening. They hoisted the lumber up on deck, climbed out, stood for a moment without speaking, savoring the exquisite feeling of safety. Later, to the privacy of his diary, Macklin confided, "I do not think I ever had such a horrible, sickening sensation of fear as I had whilst in the hold of that breaking ship." Within an hour after the last man was off, the ice pierced her sides. Sharp spears drove through first, opening wounds that let in whole blocks and chunks of floes. Everything from midships forward was now submerged. The entire starboard side of the deckhouse had been crushed by the ice with such force that some empty gasoline cans stacked on the deck had been shoved through the deckhouse wall, halfway across to the other side, carrying before them a framed picture that had hung on the wall. Somehow the glass on its front had not broken. Later, after things had settled down at the camp, a few men returned to look at the derelict that had been their ship, but not many. Most of them huddled in their tents, cold through and tired, for the first time being indifferent to their fate. The general feeling of relief at being off the ship was not shared by one man, at least not in the larger sense. He was a thick-set individual, wide face and broad nose. He spoke of the trance of an Irish brogue. During the hours it took to abandon the ship, he remained more or less apart as the equipment, dogs, and men were getting off. His name was Sir Ernest Shackleton, and the 27 men he had watched so ingloriously leaving their stricken ship were members of his Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. The date was October 27, 1915. The name of the ship was Endurance. Position was 69 degrees, 5 minutes south, 51 degrees, 30 minutes west, deep in the icy wasteland of Antarctic's treacherous Weddell Sea, just about midway between the South Pole and the nearest known outposts of humanity, some 1,200 miles away. Few men have borne the responsibility Shackleton did at that moment. Though he was certainly aware that their situation was desperate, he could not possibly have imagined then the physical and emotional demands that ultimately would be placed on them, the rigors they would have to endure, sufferings which they would be subjected. They were, for all practical purposes, alone in the frozen Antarctic seas. It had been nearly a year since they had last been in contact with civilization. Nobody in the outside world knew they were in trouble, much less where they were. They had no radio transmitter with which to notify any would-be rescuers, and it's doubtful that any rescuers could have reached them even if they had been able to broadcast an SOS. It was 1915. There were no helicopters, no weasels, no snowcats, no suitable planes. Thus their plight was naked and terrifying in its simplicity. If they were to get out, they had to get themselves out. Shackleton estimated the shelf ice off the Palmer Peninsula, the nearest known land, to be 182 miles west-southwest of them. But the land itself was 210 miles away, was inhabited by neither human beings nor animals, and offered nothing in the way of relief or rescue. The nearest known place where they might at least find food and shelter was tiny Paulet Island, less than a mile and a half in diameter, which lay 346 miles northwest across the heaving pack ice. There, in 1903, 12 years before, the crew of a Swedish ship had spent the winter after their vessel, the Antarctic, had been crushed by the Weddell sea ice. The ship which finally rescued that party deposited its stock of stores on Paulet Island for the use of any later castaways. Ironically, it was Shackleton himself who had been commissioned at the time to purchase those stores, and now, a dozen years later, it was he who needed them. That's the end of Chapter 1. Next video will be for Chapter 2.